The prairie wind whipped mercilessly across the open square of Willow Creek, carrying with it the fine dust that stung the eyes and settled deep into the throat. Lorna stepped down from the creaking stagecoach, her boots sinking into the dry earth, and in that moment, the world seemed to pause only to laugh at her. Harsh voices rose immediately, cutting through the afternoon heat like jagged knives. Well, motlugglunk be. They actually sent the big widow. A woman in a faded yellow dress sneered, her hand covering her mouth in mock surprise. Look at the size of her. And that scar on her face. Lord have mercy, who thought that was a good match for any man? Laughter rippled through the gathering crowd of townsfolk. Men leaned against hitching posts, shaking their heads with cruel amusement. Women clutched their baskets tighter, whispering loudly enough for Lorna to hear every word. Forsaken and forgotten, that's what she is. Came all this way thinking someone wanted her. Poor thing does to know it, it's all a joke. Lorna stood frozen for a breath, her heart thundering in her chest like the hooves of the horses that had pulled her here. Her fingers tightened around the handles of her single worn carpetbag until her knuckles turned white. The jagged scar along her left cheek burned under their stares, a reminder of the wagon accident that had taken her first husband and left her with nothing but this broken body society loved to mock. She had traveled for days with hope flickering faintly in her chest, the promise of a new life as a mail-order bride in this frontier town. Now that flame felt on the verge of being snuffed out entirely. The sun beat down relentlessly, its heat mixing with the earthy smell of horse sweat and leather from the coach. Dust coated her tongue, making each swallow difficult. Yet amid the cruelty, the old stage driver gave her a subtle nod as he unloaded her small trunk, his eyes kind for just a moment before he climbed back aboard. It was a small warmth, but one that kept her from crumbling right there in the square. She took a slow breath, forcing her broad shoulders to straighten despite the weight of their words. This was the way of things, she told herself quietly. People saw her full figure, wide hips, soft rounded belly, thick arms, and decided she was unworthy of tenderness. The scar only made it easier for them to turn away. In the quiet of her heart, a deep reflection stirred. How many times had she believed a new place might finally see past the surface to the resilient woman beneath? The one who could love fiercely, who longed to build a home and perhaps one day hold children close. Would Willow Creek be any different from the places that had cast her out before? As the crowd continued their jeering, a small girl no older than 6 tugged at her mother's skirt nearby. The child stared up at Lorna, not with mockery, but with open curiosity and the faintest smile, as if seeing something gentle in the big woman's hazel eyes. Another small warmth bloomed in Lorna's chest. She offered the tiniest smile back, and the girl waved shyly before being pulled away. Then there was the third quiet beat. Lorna's own inner resolve, that stubborn spark that had carried her across the plains. She would not cry here, not in front of them. If this tale of a big-hearted woman facing the harshest of welcomes touches something in you, perhaps take a moment to like and leave a kind comment about what you hope happens next for Lorna. It helps stories like this find more hearts that need them. The mockery grew louder. Someone called out, "Better turn that coach around. Missy." "Ain't no man here looking for a giantess." Laughter followed, echoing off the wooden storefronts. Lorna lifted her chin, her long brown hair catching the breeze beneath her simple bonnet. She scanned the square for any sign of the man who was supposed to meet her, the one whose letters had been brief but promising. Instead, only hostile faces greeted her. Her carpetbag felt heavier with every passing second, the fabric of her faded blue calico dress clinging to her skin from the journey and the heat. She took one step forward, then another, the dust puffing up around her ankles. The general store loomed ahead, its sign creaking in the wind. Perhaps she could wait inside, away from the eyes. Perhaps the man would still come. But doubt gnawed at her. The betrayal of coming all this way only to face this, it settled heavy in her bones. Unbeknownst to the jeering crowd, a massive figure had been watching from the shadowed porch of the blacksmith's shop across the square. He towered there, his immense frame nearly blocking the doorway. 6 feet 10 inches of solid mountain man, with arms like tree trunks and a presence that could silence a room without a word. His piercing blue eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, the cruel laughter, the woman standing tall despite it all. He shifted his weight, the wooden boards groaning beneath him. He had heard about the mail-order bride arriving today. The whole town had turned it into a cruel joke from the moment the arrangement was known. But as he watched Lorna, something stirred in his stoic chest. A protective instinct he rarely let surface. The crowd began to part slightly as his shadow stretched long across the dusty ground toward her. Lorna felt the change in the air before she saw him, the sudden hot that fell over the townspeople. She turned slowly, her hazel eyes widening as they landed on the giant cowboy, stepping into the sunlight. His boots thudded heavily with each step. He said nothing yet, but his gaze locked on hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch. For the first time since stepping off that coach, someone wasn't laughing. But what would this towering stranger do? Would he join the mockery? Or had destiny just taken its first unexpected turn in the most unlikely form? The towering stranger moved through the parting crowd with deliberate, unhurried steps, his heavy boots thudding against the packed dirt of the square like distant thunder. Lorna's breath caught as his immense shadow fell over her, blocking the harsh afternoon sun that had been beating down on her shoulders. The air around him carried the faint, comforting scent of pine, leather, and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the dusty bitterness that had filled her lungs moments earlier. Without a single word, he reached down and lifted her small trunk as though it were no heavier than a child's toy. His massive hands, calloused and strong, closed around the handles with effortless grace. The crowd, that had been so loud only seconds ago, fell into a stunned, uneasy silence. A few men who had been laughing the loudest now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to the ground. Lorna stared up at him, her hazel eyes wide. He stood at least 1.5 feet taller than her, his broad shoulders seeming to stretch endlessly against the blue sky. His thick dark beard framed a face that was rugged yet kind in its stoicism. Those piercing blue eyes met hers for a long moment, not with pity or mockery, but with something steady and protective that made her heart stutter. One of the bolder townsfolk, the woman in the yellow dress, recovered enough to sneer. "Well now, Gideon, you fixing to take on this charity case yourself?" The giant, Gideon, she now knew, did not even turn his head toward the woman. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, a subtle shift in his powerful frame that somehow carried more weight than any shouted threat. The woman faltered and took a step back, her mouth snapping shut. In that quiet moment, Lorna felt a small warmth bloom in her chest, the first genuine one since arriving. This mountain of a man had not spoken, yet his presence alone had pushed back the cruelty like a shield. Another warmth followed when she noticed the little girl from earlier, peeking out from behind her mother's skirt, giving Lorna a small, secret wave and a bright smile. And the third came as Gideon adjusted his grip on her trunk and gave the faintest nod toward the general store, as if asking her permission to lead the way. She found herself nodding in return before she could think better of it. Her boots stirred the dust as she fell into step beside him, feeling tiny yet strangely safe in his towering shadow. The fabric of her calico dress brushed against her full figure as she walked, but for once the awareness of her size did not fill her with shame. Not with him beside her. As they moved away from the square, Lorna's mind turned inward with quiet reflection. How many times had she been left to face the world's harsh judgment alone? Her late husband had been kind in his own distant way, but never protective like this. Never willing to stand between her and the mockery. Yet here was this stranger, this giant cowboy, stepping forward without being asked. What did it mean? Could a man like him truly see past her scarred cheek and soft, unfashionable body to the heart that still hoped for belonging? Gideon walked in silence, his long strides shortened to match hers. He carried her trunk on one shoulder now, as easily as if it were a sack of flour. Every now and then his blue eyes would sweep the street ahead, and any lingering stare from passers-by would quickly dart away. His stoic presence was more powerful than any words could have been. They reached the edge of the square, where a weathered, buckboard wagon waited, hitched to two sturdy horses. Gideon placed her trunk carefully in the back, then turned to her once more. For the first time, he spoke. His voice low and deep like rumbling from a distant mountain. "Name S. Gideon." Just 3 words. But they carried the weight of quiet authority, and something warmer beneath. Lorna swallowed, her voice soft when she replied. "Lorna." He gave another small nod, then offered his large hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. His palm was warm and surprisingly gentle despite its size. As his fingers closed carefully around hers, a new kind of heat spread through her, not fear, but the tiniest spark of hope. The wagon creaked as she settled onto the wooden bench. Gideon climbed up beside her, the vehicle dipping noticeably under his weight. He took the reins in his big hands and gave them a light flick. The horses started forward with a gentle jolt. Behind them, the murmurs of the townsfolk slowly resumed, but they no longer reached Lorna with the same sting. She glanced back once and saw several people watching them leave, their expressions a mix of disbelief and unease. Gideon kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his shoulder brushed lightly against hers, whether by accident or not. She couldn't tell. That brief contact sent another small wave of warmth through her. Yet as the town faded behind them and the open prairie stretched ahead, an unresolved question hung heavy in the air between them. Why had this silent giant come for her? Was he the man who had sent for the mail-order bride? Or was he simply offering protection to a stranger out of some deep sense of honor? Lorna stole a glance at his strong profile, wondering what secrets this mountain man carried in his stoic heart, and whether this unexpected protection would last beyond the dusty streets of Willow Creek or crumble once they reached wherever he was taking her. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of a modest 2-story boarding house on the quieter edge of Willow Creek. The evening light had softened into golden hues, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden steps. Gideon climbed down first, his massive frame making the vehicle sway gently. He offered Lorna his hand once more, that same careful gentleness in his touch that made her fingers tingle, even through the worn fabric of her glove. Inside, the boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage, old wood, and a faint trace of lye soap used to scrub the floors that morning. The owner, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a pinched mouth, showed them to a small room on the 2nd floor. She muttered something under her breath about strange pairings, but fell silent the instant Gideon's stoic gaze landed on her. The woman handed over a brass key and hurried away, her footsteps fading down the narrow hallway. Lorna stepped into the plainly furnished room, her heart still heavy from the day's relentless cruelty. The narrow bed creaked under her weight as she sat on its edge, the thin mattress dipping with her full figure. Gideon placed her trunk carefully just inside the door, then stepped back into the hallway without a word. He did not leave. Instead, he positioned himself against the wall, beside her door, arms crossed over his broad chest, standing guard like a silent sentinel carved from the mountains themselves. His shadow stretched long across the floorboards visible beneath the gap at the bottom of the door. A quiet reassurance that no one would trouble her here. Alone now, Lorna let her shoulders slump for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach. A soft knock came moments later. The owner returned, thrusting an envelope into her hands. From back east, the woman said with a knowing smirk before disappearing downstairs again. The paper felt cool and slightly stiff between Lorna's fingers, the faint scent of rosewater perfume still clinging to it, her sister's favorite. That sensory moment grounded her, pulling her back to the life she had left behind, the one that had never truly wanted her. She opened the letter with trembling hands. It was from Eliza, her only sister. The familiar looping handwriting made Lorna's chest tighten painfully. As her eyes moved across the lines, the words blurred through sudden hot tears that spilled freely down her cheeks, tracing the jagged scar that had marked her as different for so long. The letter revealed everything in cruel, casual detail. Dearest Lorna, mote hope this finds you well in your new adventure. We all agreed it was for the best. After the accident and your condition, no decent man here would have you. Arranging that mail order match out west was the only way to give you a chance. Or at least to finally be rid of the burden you become to the family. It was a bit of a jest among us at first. But who knows? Maybe that rough country will suit someone of your size and scarred face better than civilized society ever did. Eliza went on to describe how the family had exaggerated Lorna's qualities in the letters sent west, never expecting anyone to claim her, but hoping the frontier would swallow her up and solve their problem once and for all. The words painted a picture of laughter around the supper table, back home, the cruel joke that had shipped her away, like unwanted freight. A quiet, emotional reflection settled over Lorna like a heavy quilt. How could the people who shared her blood be so heartless? She had always tried to be useful after her husband's death. Cooking, cleaning, mending what she could despite the whispers about her wide hips and soft belly. She had borne their sideways glances and sharp comments with quiet resilience, believing family bonds ran deeper than society's scorn. Yet here was proof that to her own kin, she was nothing more than an embarrassment, a burden to be discarded with a prank dressed up as opportunity. The betrayal cut deeper than any scar, deeper than the dust-choked mockery in the town square. Even in that pain, 3 small warmth beats found their way to her. First came the memory of the little girl in the square, peeking out with that innocent wave and bright smile that had seen something gentle in Lorna's hazel eyes, instead of the flaws everyone else mocked. Second was the way Gideon had lifted her trunk earlier, as if it weighed nothing, his towering presence turning cruel laughter into uneasy silence, without a single spoken threat. Third came now, in this very moment, the subtle knowledge that he remained right outside her door, his massive frame a steadfast shield, keeping the world's cruelty at bay for one more night. She cried quietly, her shoulders shaking with soft sobs that she tried to muffle against her sleeve. The sound was low, but she knew Gideon could likely hear every bit of it through the thin walls. He never moved from his post. His subtle character behavior, the way he remained rooted there without knocking or intruding, spoke volumes more than any murmured comfort ever could. It was protection given freely, without demand or pity. Downstairs, faint voices drifted up the stairwell. Townsfolk gathered in the parlor, gossiping with sneering laughter about the giant and the big widow and speculating how the match must be some kind of prank on both sides. The words stung, but up here in this small lamplit room, Lorna felt the first real crack in the armor around her guarded heart. The oil lamp on the bedside table flickered, sending soft shadows dancing across the faded wallpaper. Outside her window, the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the distant low of cattle and the faint scent of evening cook fires. She folded the letter slowly, pressing the damp paper to her chest. The betrayal still burned, but so did a fragile new question. Why had Gideon stepped forward today? He had not been the man named in the original arrangement. She was certain of that now. Had he simply seen a forsaken woman in need and chosen to stand between her and the jeers? Or was there more to this silent mountain man than even the townsfolk understood? Lorna stood and walked to the door, her boots soft on the floorboards. Her hand hovered over the knob for a long moment before she turned it. The door opened a crack. Gideon turned his head slightly, those piercing blue eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. He waited, patient as the mountains themselves. "And, Fort. Mote received a letter," she whispered, her voice thick with the weight of fresh tears. Gideon gave a single slow nod. as if he already sensed the depth of the wound inside her. His massive frame remained rooted, ready to listen or to protect, whichever she needed most in this moment. But as Lorna hesitated there in the doorway, the lamplight spilling into the hallway and catching the hard lines of his bearded face, a new fear bloomed deep in her chest. If she told this stranger the full truth about her family's betrayal and the cruel prank that had truly brought her here, would he turn away like everyone else had? Or would this stoic giant prove to be the first soul who stayed, forcing her to confront the possibility that destiny might yet rewrite the joke her own blood had played on her? The hallway lamplight spilled across Gideon's broad shoulders as Lorna stood in the doorway, the crumpled letter still clutched in her hand. She whispered the truth of it then, her voice barely louder than the creak of the old floorboards under her boots. He listened without interruption, his piercing blue eyes steady on hers, absorbing every painful detail of the betrayal from her own blood. When she finished, he gave one slow nod, the kind that carried more weight than any spoken vow. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the prairie air carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush and distant rain that had fallen overnight. Lorna had barely slept, the weight of her sister's words pressing on her chest like an unseen hand. With no money left after the long journey and nowhere else to turn, she knew she could not stay, hidden in this boarding house, forever. She needed honest work, something to prove to herself, and this strange new town that she was more than the forsaken widow they mocked. Gideon was waiting downstairs when she descended, his massive frame filling the narrow parlor like a living mountain. He had not slept in a bed either. The subtle character behavior showed in the faint crease of his worn flannel shirt, and the way he stood ready at the door, hat in hand, as if he had kept vigil through the night. Without a word, he fell into step beside her as she stepped out into the morning light, matching his long stride to her shorter one. The townsfolk they passed on the boardwalk cast sideways glances, their whispers rising like venomous smoke. But Gideon's presence turned every sneer into uneasy silence. They reached the general store just as the owner, Mr. Hargrove, a wiry man with a perpetual scowl and grease-stained apron, unlocked the front door. The bell above it jingled sharply, a bright sensory moment that cut through the quiet street and reminded Lorna of simpler times when bells had signaled welcome rather than judgment. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled smells of coffee beans, leather goods, and the faint mustiness of stored flour sacks stacked along one wall. Shelves groaned under bolts of calico and tins of nails, the wooden floor already dusty from yesterday's foot traffic. Lorna approached the counter, her full figure casting a soft shadow across the polished wood. Her heart thudded heavily beneath her faded blue dress, the fabric pulling gently across her rounded belly and wide hips with each breath. "Sir," she said softly, keeping her hazel eyes lowered at first, "Mot met seeking honest work. Mot can scrub floors, wash windows, mend what needs mending. Anything at all. Mot don't ask for much, just enough to eat and a roof." Mr. Hargrove looked her up and down, his lip curling in that familiar cruel way. "Scrub floors, eh? With those big arms of yours, maybe you could handle it. But Mot ain't running no charity for oversized widows with scarred faces. Folks round here already laughing about you. What makes you think Mot hire the town's latest joke?" The words landed like stones, but before Lorna could respond, Gideon stepped forward. His towering presence filled the narrow aisle, the floorboards groaning faintly under his weight. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, counting out several coins with deliberate care. He placed them on the counter with a quiet thud that echoed like finality. The owner's eyes widened at the sum, far more than a week's wages for simple scrubbing. Gideon's voice came low and authoritative, each word measured and powerful. "She works here. Pay her fare. And watch your tongue." It was not a request. The subtle shift in Gideon's massive shoulders, the way his blue eyes locked onto Mr. Hargrove without blinking, carried an unspoken warning that made the smaller man swallow hard and nod once, muttering something about no trouble under his breath. Gideon did not move until the owner pocketed the coins and handed Lorna a bucket and scrub brush from behind the counter, his hands trembling just slightly. Lorna felt the quiet emotional reflection settle deep within her as she accepted the tools. Here she was, offering the only skills she had, her strong back, her willing hands, hoping to carve out some small piece of independence in a world that had tried to discard her like the letter from her sister. Yet even in this moment of seeking work, Gideon had stepped in again, not as a savior who diminished her, but as a silent protector who made space for her strength to shine. It stirred something tender in her scarred heart, the realization that perhaps belonging did not require erasing her size or her past, only someone willing to stand beside it. 3 small warmth beats followed in quick succession, like gentle sparks against the chill of uncertainty. First came the way. Gideon lingered near the door after the transaction, his broad back turned to the street, but his posture angled protectively toward her, as if ready to shield her from any further mockery. Second was the faint scent of fresh bread wafting from the store's back room, where a young boy no older than 8 peeked out and offered Lorna a shy, gap-toothed smile, another child seeing past her appearance to the kindness in her eyes. Third came when Mr. Hargrove, under Gideon's watchful gaze, actually mumbled a gruff, "Start with the front porch," without the usual sneer, granting her the dignity of honest labor for the first time in days. She set to work immediately, the scrub brush moving in steady circles across the wooden planks, water sloshing cool against her calloused hands. The rhythmic motion grounded her, each stroke washing away a little of the dust from her journey and the heavier dust of betrayal. Gideon remained outside, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, his hat pulled low but those blue eyes scanning the street. Townsfolk passed by, some sneering openly at the giant babysitting the big widow, but his stoic presence turned their cruelty into muttered discomfort. As the sun climbed higher and the porch began to gleam under her efforts, Lorna allowed herself one long, healing breath. The work was hard, her back aching from bending, yet it felt like purpose taking root. Gideon had paid her wage in advance without being asked, ensuring she could eat tonight without begging. It was protection wrapped in quiet honor, the kind that asked nothing in return. But as she straightened for a moment to wipe her brow, catching Gideon's eye across the distance, a new unresolved tension coiled in her chest. Why was this mountain man investing so much in a woman the whole town had deemed unworthy? Was it mere pity for a forsaken widow? Or something deeper stirring in his stoic heart that even he had not yet named? And what would happen when the coins ran out and the cruel jokes turned from whispers to something more pointed, testing the limits of his silent guardianship? The afternoon sun climbed higher over Willow Creek, warming the freshly scrubbed planks of the general store porch, until they gleamed with a faint, clean sheen. Lorna straightened for a moment, wiping her brow with the back of her sleeve, the cool dampness of the scrub brush still clinging to her fingers. Her back ached from the steady work, but the rhythm had become almost soothing, a small anchor in the storm of uncertainty that had followed her since the stagecoach arrival. 2 small figures appeared at the edge of the boardwalk, then hesitant at first, their bare feet kicking up tiny puffs of dust that carried the faint, earthy scent of the prairie mixed with the unwashed tang of children who had known too many nights without a proper home. The boy, no more than 8, clutched a frayed slingshot in one hand, his patched shirt hanging loose on narrow shoulders. Beside him stood a girl of about 6, her tangled hair falling across eyes too old for her years. The town ignored these 2 orphans most days, calling them the strays in sneering tones that echoed the same cruelty leveled at Lorna herself. Yet here they were, drawn like moths to the gentle murmur of Lorna's voice as she had hummed a half-remembered lullaby while working, the notes soft and unassuming, carrying on the light breeze. They trailed her quietly at first, staying a few paces behind as she moved along the porch with her bucket. The sensory moment wrapped around Lorna like a fragile thread, the soft tug of the little girl's small hand brushing against the hem of her calico skirt, the warmth of those tiny fingers tentative yet trusting, the faint soap and dust scent rising from their hair as they drew closer. It stirred something deep and unfamiliar in her chest, a pull she had long told herself she must resist. One of the passing townsfolk, a stout man in a dusty vest, sneered openly as he strode by. "Look at that. The big widow collecting strays now. As if she ain't a burden enough on her own. Who'd want a scarred giantess playing mother to anyone?" His companion laughed sharply, the sound cutting through the afternoon like a whip crack before they moved on, leaving the words hanging heavy in the air. Gideon remained at his post across the street, leaning against the same post with his massive arms crossed over his barrel chest. His subtle character behavior spoke volumes without a gesture wasted. He shifted his weight ever so slightly, angling his towering frame to cast a longer protective shadow toward the porch, his piercing blue eyes never leaving the scene. He said nothing, but the stoic set of his shoulders made it clear no further cruelty would reach her, or the children, while he stood watch. Lorna paused, bucket in hand, and turned toward the small pair. Her heart thudded with quiet emotional reflection that settled like evening mist over her thoughts. She had always longed for children in the secret corners of her heart, imagining soft voices and small arms around her. Yet the betrayal from her own blood, the endless mockery of her full figure and jagged scar, had convinced her she had nothing to give. What kind of mother could she be? Penniless. Forsaken her body. The very thing society laughed at off. These children needed stability, not another soul the world had already deemed unworthy. The fear coiled tight inside her, reluctant motherhood, stirring despite her best efforts to push it down. She was barely keeping herself afloat. How could she possibly open her arms to more? Still, the little girl looked up first. Hazel eyes meeting Lorna's with a shy wonder that made the scar on her cheek feel less like a brand. "You got a kind voice, miss," the child whispered. The words barely audible, but carrying the weight of a child who had heard too few gentle ones. The boy nodded, scuffing his toe against the wood. "We don't got nowhere else. Folks say we re trouble. But you don't look at us mean." 3 small warmth beats bloomed then, gentle and unexpected, pushing back against the chill of Lorna's doubts. The first came when the girl slipped her tiny hand fully into Lorna's larger one, the trust in that simple grip wrapping around her heart like a soft quilt. The second arrived as the boy offered her a single wilted wildflower he had pulled from the roadside earlier, murmuring, "For you, Ma," the words slipping out so naturally it stole her breath. And the third settled deep when she felt Gideon's gaze from across the street, steady, approving, his massive frame a silent promise that she was not facing this moment alone. She knelt slowly, her wide hips and soft rounded belly making the motion careful yet deliberate, bringing herself closer to their level. The fabric of her dress pooled around her boots, and for once the awareness of her size did not sting quite so sharply. "Mott met Lorna," she murmured, her voice low and warm, "and Mott reckoned we could sit a spell together. No promises beyond that today." The children pressed in closer, their small bodies leaning against her sides, with the easy affection of those starved for kindness. The girl rested her head against Lorna's arm, the faint warmth of her cheek seeping through the sleeve. The boy chattered softly about a bird's nest he had found that morning, his words tumbling out like a stream finding its pay-a-tay hat after too long a drought. Lorna listened, her scarred face softening into the faintest smile, the kind that reached her hazel eyes and made the afternoon light feel kinder somehow. From the store doorway, Mr. Hargrove poked his head out and sneered under his breath. "Don't be filling their heads with nonsense, widow. You got work to finish, not play acting at family." But Gideon's single step forward from his post across the street, boots thudding once against the boardwalk, silenced the man instantly. The owner retreated without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Lorna's hands moved gently, one resting on the girl's tangled hair, the other steadying the boy's shoulder. In that quiet stretch of time, the reluctant pull in her chest grew stronger, a tender ache she could no longer ignore. These children saw her, not the size, not the scar, not the joke her own family had made of her life, but the woman who hummed lullabies and offered steady hands. It terrified her and healed her in equal measure. Yet as the sun began its slow descent, and the children showed no sign of leaving her side, A new unresolved tension tightened around Lorna's heart. The little girl looked up again, eyes shining with fragile hope, and whispered the question that hung in the air like an open loop between them. "Will you be our ma for real? Not just today?" The boy nodded eagerly beside her, both of them waiting, small hands still clutching her skirt, as if afraid she might vanish like every other kindness they had known. Gideon watched from his post, his stoic expression unchanging, but Lorna caught the subtle shift in his blue eyes, a question of his own that mirrored hers. Could a forsaken widow with nothing to her name truly open the door to reluctant motherhood? Or would the cruel world that had already betrayed her blood once find a way to snatch even this budding warmth away before it could take root? The question hung between them on the store porch, like a fragile thread spun from hope and fear, the little girl's hazel eyes still fixed on Lorna with that wide, waiting shine. Gideon's boots thudded softly across the boardwalk. Then, each step measured and unhurried, closing the distance without a word wasted. He stopped just behind Lorna, his immense shadow stretching long over the three of them in the late afternoon light. And the children instinctively pressed closer to her sides as if sensing the safety he carried. "Wagons hitched," he murmured, voice low and deep, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. "Cabins in the hollow. Room enough. Safer." No promises beyond that, yet the authority in his tone left no room for doubt. The townsfolk's sneers had grown bolder as the day wore on. He had seen it. Lorna glanced up at him, her heart giving a quiet lurch, and found herself nodding before the reluctance in her chest could form words. The boy slipped his small hand into hers, the girl doing the same on the other side, and together they followed Gideon to the waiting buckboard. The ride out of Willow Creek stretched long and quiet, the prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub pine. The wagon creaked rhythmically beneath them, wheels turning over ruts worn deep by years of frontier travel. Lorna kept one arm around each child, their small bodies warm against her full figure, while Gideon drove with those large hands steady on the reins. The air cooled as they descended into the hollow, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine resin and distant wood smoke. The first true sensory moment that wrapped around her like an unexpected embrace after too many days of dust and mockery. It smelled of possibility, of something solid and rooted, far from the jeering square. The cabin appeared as the trees parted. A sturdy log structure nestled against a gentle slope, its chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke that Gideon must have banked before leaving town that morning. He helped her down first, then the children, his touch careful on her elbow, as though her soft, rounded form were something precious rather than the burden others named it. Inside, the single room lay dim and dusty, slanting sunlight cutting through the one small window to dance with motes that swirled in the air like forgotten memories. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, a narrow bunk against one wall, a stone hearth cold but ready. The floorboards showed the faint tracks of mice and neglect, the air carrying the faint must of unused space. Lorna set her carpetbag down and moved without being asked. This was her skill, the one thing she had always offered the world, even when it laughed at the hands that wielded it. She found a broom propped in the corner, simple straw bound with twine, and began sweeping, the rhythmic whisper of bristles against wood filling the quiet. Dust rose in soft clouds, carrying the earthy scent of the hollow with it. She wiped the table next with a rag. She dampened from the bucket by the door, then straightened the thin quilt on the bunk, tucking its edges with practiced care. Small touches, yes, but each one transformed the space bit by bit. A sprig of wildflowers the children had gathered on the ride now stood in a tin cup at the table's center. Her spare apron hung from a peg by the hearth. The faint aroma of coffee beans she had coaxed from the general store earlier began to rise as she set a pot to warm on the rekindled fire. Gideon watched from the doorway, his massive frame leaning against the rough-hewn frame with arms crossed over his barrel chest. That was his subtle character behavior, silent, unmoving, yet present in every line of his towering body. He did not hover or direct. He simply observed, blue eyes following the sway of her calico skirt, the way her scarred cheek caught the firelight as she bent to stir the pot. No words, only the steady weight of his gaze that made the cabin feel less like shelter and more like the beginning of something tender. In the quiet stretch between sweeps and stirs, a quiet emotional reflection settled over Lorna, like the golden light spilling through the window. Homemaking had always been her quiet rebellion against the world's cruelty, turning empty spaces into havens when no one believed she deserved one. Her own blood had shipped her away as a joke. Society had mocked her wide hips and soft belly at every turn. Yet here, in this dusty hollow, she felt her hands remembering their purpose. The children chattered softly as they helped, the boy stacking kindling, the girl folding a scrap of cloth into a doll's blanket. For the first time since the stagecoach dust had choked her arrival, Lorna wondered if her skills might weave more than survival. Could they stitch together a fragile belonging for all of them? 3 small warmth beats bloomed then, gentle and unhurried. The first came when the little girl tugged at Lorna's skirt and whispered, "It feels like home already, Ma." The words slipping out again with such easy trust that Lorna's throat tightened. The second arrived, as Gideon crossed the room without a sound, and handed her a small bundle of dried herbs from a shelf she had not yet reached, sage and lavender, their faint fragrance rising between them like a shared secret. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, his caused warmth lingering just long enough to send a flicker of something new through her. The third settled deep when the boy looked up from the hearth, face smudged te hot ash, and grinned at Gideon. "You got a big house, and she makes it nice." The giant cowboy-ass mouth curved in the faintest hint of a smile, the first Lorna had seen, and it softened the hard lines of his bearded face like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They ate simply that evening. Beans and cornbread warmed over the fire, the children's laughter rising soft between bites. Gideon sat across the table, his massive shoulders hunched slightly so as not to overwhelm the space, and for the first time, the silence between him and Lorna felt companionable rather than heavy. She caught him watching her again as she wiped a smudge of cornbread from the girl's cheek, his blue eyes holding a warmth that mirrored the fire's glow. The flicker bloomed there between them, small yet undeniable. The first true spark of connection in this remote hollow, born not from grand words, but from the quiet rhythm of her homemaking and his silent guardianship. Outside the hollow grew dark, crickets beginning their evening song against the whisper of wind through the pines. Lorna tucked the children into the bunk with the quilt she had straightened earlier, their small bodies curling close as sleep claimed them. Gideon banked the fire with deliberate care, then straightened to his full height, filling the doorway once more. She turned to him then, the lamplight catching the jagged line of her scar. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with the day's accumulated tenderness. "For this place. For letting me make it ours. Even for tonight." He gave a single nod, but his eyes held hers longer than before. The flicker of warmth had settled into something steadier, something that asked its own silent questions. Yet as the cabin fell quiet and the children's breathing evened into sleep, Lorna felt a new unresolved tension coil in her chest. In the soft glow of the dying fire, she noticed the way Gideon's gaze lingered on the three of them. Protective, yes, but carrying a depth she had not seen before. What if this homemaking, this fragile warmth blooming between them, was only the beginning of a destiny neither had dared name? And what would happen when the outside world, its cruel jokes and blood betrayals, found its way into this hidden hollow, and tested the strength of the home she had just begun to build with her own 2 hands? The morning light filtered softly through the cabin's single window, painting the rough log walls in warm golden tones that danced across the freshly swept floorboards. Lorna stood at the rough-hewn table, her strong hands kneading dough for fresh bread with steady, practiced rhythm, the yeasty scent rising warm and comforting in the small space. Ellie and Tommy, the children had shyly offered their names the night before, as if handing over fragile treasures, hovered close, their small fingers poking experimentally into the soft mass, giggling when flour dusted their noses. The sensory moment wrapped around them all like a gentle embrace, the faint crackle of the rekindled fire, mixing with the earthy pine air drifting in from the open door, grounding Lorna in a peace she had not known since before the stagecoach dust had choked her arrival. Gideon stood in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the bright hollow outside, watching without a word. His subtle character behavior spoke in the quiet way he lingered there, arms crossed over his barrel chest, blue eyes following every gentle motion she made with the children, as though memorizing the scene for some private keeping. He had banked the fire earlier and hitched the wagon without being asked, his towering presence a steady anchor in the quiet morning. "Supplies," he murmured at last, voice low and authoritative like the rumble of distant thunder. "Town run quick." No more was needed. Lorna nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, and soon they were all bundled into the buckboard. The children nestled safely between her and Gideon as the horses pulled them back toward Willow Creek. The prairie rolled past in soft waves of grass and scrub, the wagon creaking companionably under their weight. For a stretch, the world felt almost kind. But the moment they rolled into the town square, the cruelty returned like a sudden storm. Townsfolk gathered near the general store and the bakery next door, their voices rising in sharp, sneering waves that cut through the morning bustle. The air carried the sharp, buttery scent of fresh baked loaves from the open bakery door, mingling with the dusty leather and horse sweat of the square. A cruel contrast to the warmth Lorna had left behind in the hollow. "Look at that." A stout woman in a faded bonnet sneered loudly, pointing with her basket. The giantess playing house with the big scarred widow and her stray pups, as if she could mother anything without crushing it under all that weight. Laughter rippled cruelly from the cluster of men leaning against hitching posts. "Kindest lady." More like the towness' latest joke. Bet her own blood was right to ship her off. Who wants a forsaken giantess pretending at family? The words landed heavy, the mockery twisting like thorns around Lorna's soft, rounded belly, and the jagged scar on her cheek. Her hazel eyes lowered, focusing on steadying the children as they climbed down, but inside her chest a familiar ache bloomed. Yet before she could draw a breath to steady herself, Tommy stepped forward, his small chest puffing courage an 8-year-old could muster. His hands balled into tiny fists at his sides, voice cracking but loud enough to carry across the square. "Don't you talk about her like that," he shouted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Lorna is the kindest lady ever. She makes us feel safe and she hums songs when we get scared, and she don't ever yell or send us away. She's our ma now. And you all are just mean for no reason." Ellie clung to Lorna's calico skirt with both hands, her 6-year-old face flushed with determination as she glared at the crowd. "Yeah, she's beautiful inside, even with her scar. She made our cabin feel like home, and she lets us help with bread, and she looks at us like we matter. You stop being so cruel or Gideon will make you." The little girl's voice rose in passionate defense, her tangled hair swinging as she stamped one small foot, the kind of raw, unfiltered loyalty that only children untouched by years of bitterness could offer. The crowd fell into a stunned, uneasy hush, their sneers faltering under the unexpected force of 2 small voices. Whispers replaced the laughter, some uncomfortable, others shifting reluctant surprise. Lorna felt the quiet emotional reflection settle deep within her then, like a cool stream washing over parched ground. All her life, she had been the underdog, the forsaken widow whose big-size figure and scarred face made her the punchline of every cruel joke, even from her own blood. She had believed the world's verdict, that she held no true worth beyond what her hands could scrub or mend. Yet here were these children, orphaned and overlooked themselves, seeing her clearly, defending her with a fierceness that pierced straight to the heart she had guarded so carefully. They saw the kindness, the resilience, the quiet love she offered without expectation. In their eyes, she was not the joke. She was Ma. The realization brought a tender ache, a slow burn warmth that made her wonder if destiny might yet rewrite every mocking word ever spoken against her. 3 small warmth beats followed, blooming gentle and unhurried amid the tension of the square. The first came when Ellie's small hand tightened in hers, the child's trust radiating up through the fabric of her skirt, like a promise that refused to break. The second arrived, as Tommy glanced back at her after his outburst. his gap-toothed grin flashing with pride, as if he had just slain a dragon on her behalf. And the third settled deepest, when Lorna lifted her gaze to Gideon standing beside the wagon. For the first time since she had met him, a rare, genuine smile curved his stoic lips. Small, almost hidden beneath the thick dark beard, but real enough to soften the hard lines of his rugged face and light those piercing blue eyes with quiet agreement. He said nothing, yet that smile spoke volumes. He saw her true worth too, and the children's defense had pleased the silent mountain man, more than any words could. The townsfolk muttered and dispersed in uneasy clusters, casting uneasy glances toward Gideon's towering frame as he loaded the wagon with the supplies Mr. Hargrove had grudgingly provided under that watchful gaze. Lorna's heart felt lighter than it had in days, the children's voices still echoing in her ears like a healing balm. They climbed back into the wagon together, Ellie and Tommy chattering excitedly about the bad people they had stood up to, their small bodies pressing close to her sides once more. As the horses pulled them away from the square, and the hollow green slopes rose ahead, Gideon flicked the reins with one large hand, his rare smile lingering just a fraction longer, before fading back into stoic calm. Lorna stole a glance at his profile, the flicker of something deeper stirring between them once again, not yet named, but growing in the quiet spaces where cruelty could not reach. Yet as the wagon creaked along the familiar ruts toward home, a new unresolved tension coiled in Lorna's chest, tightening with every turn of the wheels. The children's defense had silenced the square today, but she caught the way a few lingering townsfolk watched them leave, their eyes narrowing with fresh calculation. What if the mockery did not end here? What if the outside world, the same one that had betrayed her blood and laughed at her sighs, found a way to strike at this fragile new worth the children had declared so boldly? And what secret burden in Gideon's stoic heart might the coming days force him to reveal? Now that the children had opened a door, neither of them could close again. The days in the hollow settled into a gentle rhythm that Lorna had not dared hope for, each sunrise bringing small stitches of belonging to the fabric of their unlikely lives. Yet the outside world refused to stay distant for long. Word spread through Willow Creek of the annual charity auction to raise funds for a new schoolhouse, an event that drew every soul from the surrounding ranches and farms. Gideon mentioned it one quiet evening by the fire, his voice low and measured, as he carved a small wooden horse for Tommy. "Town needs hands. Your quilt could help." Lorna had nodded, her fingers pausing on the needlework she had poured her evenings into. A simple yet intricate patchwork quilt pieced from scraps of calico, faded denim, and soft flannel, each stitch a quiet prayer for warmth and home. The auction day arrived under a wide blue sky, the town square transformed with long tables and a raised wooden platform where items were displayed. The air buzzed with the sensory richness of frontier gathering, the sharp tang of wood smoke from nearby cookfires, mingling with the sweet scent of apple pies and the earthy musk of horses tied along the hitching rails. Lorna stood near the back with Ellie and Tommy clutching her hands, her full figure wrapped in her best calico dress, the jagged scar on her cheek catching the sunlight as she tried to remain unseen. Gideon loomed beside them, his towering frame a silent shield, though his presence alone drew curious and mocking glances. When the auctioneer called for Lorna's quilt, lifting it high so the crowd could see the careful patterns of interlocking stars and gentle waves, the cruelty erupted like a sudden gust. "Look at that mess," a sharp-voiced woman sneered from the front row, her bonnet ribbons fluttering, stitched by the big widow herself. "Who'd want something made by hands that big? Probably heavy enough to crush a bed." Laughter rippled through the gathered townsfolk, cruel and cutting, fitting for the Forsaken One, ugly as her own face. "Bet even the giant won T-bid on that eyesore." The words hung heavy, turning the warm afternoon chill for Lorna as whispers of joke bride and blood burden floated on the breeze. Lorna felt her cheeks burn, her hazel eyes dropping to the dusty ground. The quilt, born from long nights by the cabin fire, where her hands had worked to create something beautiful from scraps, now felt like another layer of mockery laid upon her soft, rounded form. In that moment, a quiet, emotional reflection washed over her, like the cool river waters she sometimes dreamed of. She had offered her homemaking skills freely, believing they might prove her worth beyond society's scorn. Yet here again was the reminder: her size, her scar, her very existence remained fuel for their laughter. How many sacred pieces of herself must she sacrifice before the world saw the heart behind the hands? Gideon's subtle character behavior shifted then. He straightened to his full 6'10" height, his massive shoulders squaring as if the mountain itself had decided to move. He did not speak at first. Instead, he stepped forward through the parting crowd, each heavy bootfall thudding with quiet authority that silenced snickers in ripples. The auctioneer, sensing the shift, cleared his throat and began the bidding at a meager $1. $2, someone called mockingly from the side, followed by laughter. Gideon's voice cut through like a low rumble from deep earth. $100. The words fell with stoic finality, carrying across the square without need for volume. Gasps rose from the crowd. $100 was a small fortune on the frontier, more than most men earned in months of hard ranch labor. It represented nearly everything Gideon had set aside from seasons of trapping and cattle drives, the sacred savings he had guarded for his remote life in the hollow. The auctioneer blinked, stammering. 100. Going once. A man in the back sneered louder. You serious? Giant? Throwing good money at that widow's ugly work? She's already a burden on you. Gideon did not turn. His piercing blue eyes remained fixed on the quilt, then briefly on Lorna. 150. Another jump, another sacrifice laid bare. The crowd fell into stunned murmurs, their cruelty faltering under the weight of his unyielding presence. No one dared bid against him. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed like judgment reversed. Lorna stood frozen as Gideon claimed the quilt, folding it carefully over one massive arm before returning to her side. 3 small warmth beats bloomed in her chest amid the chaos of emotions. The first came when Ellie tugged her skirt and whispered, "He bought it for you, Ma, because it is special like you." The second arrived as Tommy beamed up at Gideon VKP Tehat pure hero worship, the wooden horse forgotten in his small fist. The third settled deepest when Gideon's large hand brushed hers while handing her the quilt, his calloused fingers lingering with a tenderness that spoke of protection and something far more sacred. Respect for the skill she had poured into every stitch, honoring her in front of those who had only mocked. As they loaded the wagon later with the few supplies won from the auction, the townsfolk watched from a distance, their sneers replaced by uneasy whispers. Gideon had sacrificed greatly, emptying much of what he held for the future to stand for her in that public square. Lorna clutched the quilt to her soft chest, its familiar fabric a tangible reminder of the slow burn connection growing between them. His act was no mere kindness. It was a sacred declaration in a language only the heart understood. The ride back to the hollow passed in contemplative quiet, the children dozing against her sides, while the prairie winds whispered through the grass. Gideon drove with steady hands, his profile etched in the fading light like a guardian carved from stone. Lorna studied him, her heart swelling vekepite hot unspoken gratitude and a flicker of deeper affection. He had given so much without expectation, turning the day's cruelty into a moment of profound validation. Yet as the cabin came into view and the children stirred with sleepy murmurs, a sudden revelation tightened in Lorna's chest like an open loop left unresolved. While helping unload the wagon, she noticed the faint worry crease in Gideon's brow when he checked his near-empty coin pouch. His blue eyes met hers for a long moment, and in that glance she understood the true depth of his sacrifice. Not just money, but the security he had built for all of them. What hidden costs would this sacred act bring when winter approached and the town's resentment simmered hotter? And would her growing feelings for this giant protector be enough to carry them through the trials his quiet honor had now invited? The charity auction's ripples lingered in Willow Creek like unsettled dust after a storm, but the town's annual harvest fair arrived soon after, pulling families from every corner of the prairie with promises of friendly competition and shared bounty. Lorna had prepared quietly in the cabin's warm hearth light over the preceding days, her skilled hands turning simple ingredients into golden loaves of bread, flaky pies, filled, ite hot, wild berries, and hearty cinnamon rolls whose sweet, spiced aroma had filled the hollow each evening. The children had helped ite hot eager fingers, and Gideon had watched from his usual post by the door, his silent approval a steady undercurrent to her efforts. The fairgrounds buzzed ite hat life under the bright midday sun, the air thick with the sensory symphony of sizzling sausages, fries, fresh hay, and the sweet, tart burst of ripening apples piled high on tables. Booths lined the grassy square, ribbons fluttering from displays as judges moved between them with serious nods. Lorna stood beside her baked goods entry, her full figure wrapped in a clean apron over her calico dress, the jagged scar on her cheek more visible in the open light. Ellie and Tommy bounced on their toes beside her, their small hands sticky from stolen tastes of frosting. The cruelty came swiftly, as it always did in town. A cluster of women near the baked goods table pointed openly, their voices carrying on the breeze with mocking sharpness. Look at the big widow's entry, as if those oversized hands could create anything worth eating. Probably heavy as lead, just like her. Laughter followed, sharp and biting. First place? More like last pity prize for the forsaken joke bride. Who'd want to taste something made by her scarred face and soft belly? The jeers spread, drawing more onlookers who whispered about the giantess charity project and how her own blood had wisely sent her away. Lorna kept her hazel eyes on the table, her heart tightening beneath the familiar weight of their words. In that vulnerable stretch, a quiet, emotional reflection settled over her, like the soft shade of a cottonwood tree. Despite the sacred sacrifice Gideon had made at the auction, despite the children's fierce defense, and the fragile home they were building in the hollow, the world still saw only her unconventional form and the scars life had given her. Yet her baking was an extension of her homemaking heart, the way she poured quiet love into every measured cup and gentle fold. Would this skill, too, be dismissed as unworthy, another cruel joke in the long line that had defined her? Gideon stood tall beside her, his immense 6'10" frame casting a protective shadow over the table, and the three of them. His subtle character behavior revealed itself in the way he remained utterly still, arms crossed over his broad chest, blue eyes sweeping the crowd with stoic authority that made several mockers step back without a word spoken. He did not growl or threaten. His towering presence alone served as shield and statement. The judges approached then, tasting samples with careful spoons. Time stretched, the fair noises fading into a low hum around them. Finally, the head judge cleared his throat and announced the winners. First place in baked goods goes to Lorna's berry pie and cinnamon rolls. A stunned silence fell before scattered applause broke out, some genuine, many reluctant. The ribbon was pinned to her display, its bright blue fluttering proudly despite the lingering sneers from the edges of the crowd. 3 small warmth beets bloomed in Lorna's chest like wildflowers pushing through hard soil. The first came when Ellie threw her small arms around Lorna's waist, pressing her face into the soft fabric ite hot, pure joy. You won, Ma. Your baking is the best in the whole world. The second arrived as Tommy tugged Gideon's sleeve, grinning up at the giant. See? She is the best. You were right to stand by her. The third settled, deepest when Gideon turned slightly toward her, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder for a moment. The touch warm and steady through her dress, conveying pride without need for words. His rare half-smile returned, softening the rugged lines of his bearded face as he looked down at her with those piercing blue eyes. Lorna accepted the ribbon with trembling hands, the weight of validation settling over her like a long-awaited embrace. The crowd's jeers had not vanished entirely, but Gideon's tall stance beside her made them matter less. He walked ite hat her through the fair afterward, the children skipping ahead, his massive boots thudding softly beside her lighter steps. They paused at a quiet booth, where he purchased a small tin of peppermints for the children, his actions speaking of a deepening commitment to this patchwork family. As the afternoon light lengthened and they prepared to leave the fairgrounds, Lorna felt the slow burn connection between her and Gideon strengthening. His public protection and quiet sacrifices, were weaving something beautiful from the threads of her once forsaken life. The validation of her skills today, witnessed by him, stirred a tender hope in her heart that perhaps she could truly belong. Not despite her size and scars, but because of the resilient woman she had become. Yet, as they loaded the wagon, and the children chattered excitedly about hanging the ribbon in the cabin, a sudden revelation hit Lorna with unresolved emotional tension. While helping Gideon lift a crate, she noticed the way he favored his right shoulder, slightly. A subtle wince crossing his stoic features when he thought she was looking. Combined with the thinness of his coin pouch after the quilt sacrifice, it raised a quiet question in her mind. What hidden strain was this giant protector carrying to keep them all safe and warm? And if his strength faltered under the weight of his sacred choices, would she have the courage to step forward and protect his heart in return? The Harvest Fair's excitement carried them back to the hollow that evening. The blue ribbon fluttering from Lorna's basket, like a small flag of defiance against the lingering jeers that had tried to dim her moment. Yet the validation from her baked goods wins settled deep, a quiet affirmation that her hands could create worth, even when voices called her worthless. Gideon drove the wagon with his usual stoic silence, but his hand had rested briefly on her shoulder at the fair, a public gesture that spoke louder than any shout, his quiet pride in her visible to every mocking eye. Days blended into a gentle rhythm once more, the cabin filled with the scent of fresh bread and children's laughter. Lorna's homemaking skills continued to transform the space, but the fair's success had sparked something new in her. A fragile confidence that made her stand a little taller despite her wide hips and soft belly. The children thrived under her care, calling her Ma with increasing ease, while Gideon watched over them all with his immense, protective presence. One crisp morning, as autumn painted the hollow in shades of gold and crimson, Gideon suggested they return to town for supplies. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of falling leaves and distant wood smoke, a sensory reminder that seasons were turning and life demanded preparation. Lorna agreed, packing a small basket of her cinnamon rolls as offerings for the general store, hoping to build on the fair's unexpected victory. The square buzzed "Ve Kepite hat" after fair energy when they arrived. Townsfolk still whispered, but fewer dared speak loudly in Gideon's towering shadow. Mr. Hargrove's eyes widened slightly when Lorna offered samples of her rolls, their warm, spiced aroma cutting through the store's usual musty leather and flour dust. "These sold well at the fair," she said softly, her hazel eyes steady despite the scar that marked her cheek. The owner grumbled but accepted them, and soon a small crowd gathered near the counter. The same sharp-tongued women from before approached, their expressions twisted with disbelief. "Still trying to prove yourself, big widow?" One sneered. "Those rolls probably taste as heavy as you look. First place was surely a pity win." Lorna felt the familiar sting, but before doubt could take root, a quiet, emotional reflection washed through her. The fair had shown her that validation could come even amid cruelty. Her skills, her heart, her resilience, they existed beyond the mockery of her unconventional appearance. Gideon's steady presence beside her reinforced this truth, his massive frame a living shield that allowed her quiet strength to shine. The children, ever bold now, stepped forward once more. Tommy held up a roll proudly. "Moss baking is the best." "She won fair and square," Ellie nodded fiercely, adding, "Duh. And she's beautiful too. Even if you can see it." Gideon placed his large hand gently on Lorna's shoulder again, the touch warm and deliberate. The crowd saw it clearly, the stoic giant choosing to stand beside the underdog widow without hesitation. Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their sneers fading under his authoritative gaze. Mr. Hargrove, sensing the shift, actually purchased a full batch at a fair price, muttering about good for business. 3 small warmth beats bloomed in that moment. The first came when a young mother from the crowd approached shyly, after the others dispersed, complimenting the rolls and asking for the recipe, her kind words a gentle counter to the cruelty. The second arrived as Gideon squeezed her shoulder lightly. before letting go, his blue eyes meeting hers with unspoken encouragement that made her heart flutter. The third settled when the children hugged her legs, their small bodies warm against her full figure, reminding her that true worth was measured in love given and received, not in the narrow eyes of society. As they left the store with supplies loaded, Lorna walked taller, the validation at the fair and now in the store weaving a stronger thread into her spirit. Gideon helped her onto the wagon, his hands careful as always, and for a lingering second their eyes held. The slow burn connection between them felt closer to words, though neither spoke them yet. The ride home carried a new lightness, the prairie winds whispering through the grass like approving sighs. Lorna reflected on how Gideon's public protection had turned potential humiliation into quiet triumph. Her heart, once guarded by years of rejection and betrayal, began to open further to this giant cowboy, whose actions spoke of honor and something deeper. Yet as the cabin came into view, and the children raced ahead to play, a sudden revelation brought unresolved emotional tension. While unpacking the wagon, Lorna noticed a letter tucked among the supplies, from the town preacher requesting their presence at the old church for urgent community matters the following Sunday. Gideon's jaw tightened when he read it, a rare flicker of concern crossing his stoic face. What new test of their growing bond awaited them at the altar of that weathered church? And would the validation they had found be strong enough to weather whatever storm the townsfolk planned next? Sunday dawned with a deceptive calm over the hollow, the sky a vast expanse of pale blue that promised nothing of the fury to come. Lorna smoothed her best calico dress with trembling hands, the fabric pulling gently across her full figure as she helped Ellie braid her hair and Tommy tuck in his shirt. The preacher's letter had been brief but insistent, something about community records and the mail order arrangement needing formal clarification. Gideon had read it once, his jaw tightening in that subtle way, then simply nodded. "We go," he had murmured, voice low and authoritative. Now they rode together in the wagon, the children nestled between them, the wheels turning steadily toward the old wooden church on the edge of Willow Creek. The air carried the sharp, metallic scent of approaching rain as they arrived, a sensory moment that prickled along Lorna's skin and made the fine hairs on her arms rise. Dark clouds gathered swiftly on the horizon, rolling in faster than anyone expected, turning the afternoon light to a heavy gray. Inside the weathered church, the pews held only a handful of townsfolk who had come out of curiosity rather than piety. The preacher, a thin man with nervous eyes, shuffled papers at the front altar, murmuring about legalities and proper unions in the eyes of the territory. The mockery began almost immediately in low, sneering tones from the back rows. "Look at them," a woman whispered loudly enough to carry. "The giant and his forsaken widow, here to make official what was always a cruel joke." Another man chuckled. "Bet the blood that shipped her out west is laughing still. Who binds a scarred giantess to a mountain man? This one till last past winter." Lorna kept her hazel eyes forward, her heart thudding heavily beneath her dress. The jagged scar on her cheek felt warm under the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. A quiet emotional reflection settled over her then, deep and tender like the turning of autumn leaves. She had come to this land as an underdog, betrayed by blood, mocked for her size and appearance at every turn. Yet in the hollow, with Gideon's silent protection and the children's pure affection, she had begun to taste something like belonging. Now, standing near this simple altar, she wondered if salvation could truly reach someone society had long declared unworthy. Could a formal step rewrite the cruel jokes into a destiny of protection and quiet love? The storm broke suddenly outside, rain lashing the church roof in furious sheets, while thunder rumbled like distant cannons. Wind howled around the eaves, trapping everyone inside as the downpour turned roads to mud. The preacher glanced nervously at the windows, then at Gideon. "Seems we here for a spell, best tend to the matter at hand." Gideon stepped forward then, his massive frame filling the aisle as he moved toward the altar. His subtle character behavior revealed itself in the deliberate slowness of his steps, each one measured and purposeful, the floorboards creaking under his weight like the groan of ancient trees. He did not look at the whispering townsfolk, His piercing blue eyes remained fixed ahead, then turned to Lorna with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached the front and turned to face her fully, towering yet somehow gentle in the storm's dim light. Lorna approached slowly, the children trailing close behind her, their small hands clutching her skirt. The rain drummed harder overhead, a roaring, sensory backdrop that isolated the moment inside the old church's wooden sanctuary. Gideon's voice, when it came, was low and deep, carrying the quiet power of mountain winds. Lorna. He paused, then lowered his immense body to one knee before her, the motion graceful despite his size. The townsfolk fell silent in shock. This world tried to break you with cruel jokes and blood betrayal. I want to let it. Marry me. Here. Tonight. Mot ve kept to protect you and the young ones forever. My cabin, my strength, my name. They re yours if you will have them. The proposal hung in the charged air, thunder cracking outside as if the heavens themselves witnessed it. Lorna's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her hazel eyes. 3 small warmth beats bloomed within her chest amid the storm's fury. The first came when Ellie whispered, "Say yes, Ma, he makes us safe," her small voice full of innocent hope. The second arrived as Tommy stepped forward and placed his tiny hand on Gideon's broad shoulder, declaring without fear, "You re our pa now." The third settled deepest when Gideon looked up at her from his knee, his rugged face open in a way she had never seen, revealing the stoic heart that had chosen her, scars, sighs, and all, without hesitation. She reached down, her fingers brushing his thick beard with trembling tenderness. "Yes," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Mott will marry you. Gideon." The preacher, caught in the moment, fumbled through a hasty ceremony, the words of union spoken quickly between thunderclaps. Simple vows exchanged, promises of protection, honor, and home. No rings, no grand feast, only the raw sincerity of 2 souls choosing hot other before a handful of stunned witnesses. When Gideon rose and pulled Lorna gently into his arms, his massive frame enveloping her soft rounded one ve kep, hot careful strength, the children cheered softly and pressed in close, forming a small circle of warmth against the storm. The townsfolk watched in uneasy silence, their mockery silenced by the sheer weight of the giant Cowboy's public declaration. Salvation had come at the altar, not in grand fashion, but in the honest vows of a man who saw true beauty where others saw only flaws. As the rain began to ease slightly and the group prepared to brave the muddy road home, Gideon kept one large arm around Lorna's shoulders. The new reality of their union settled over her like a protective quilt. Wife to this silent mountain man, mother in truth to the children who had chosen her. The slow burn affection that had grown between them now held the weight of sacred promise. Yet, as they stepped out into the drizzling aftermath and climbed into the wagon, a sudden revelation brought unresolved emotional tension. In the fading light, Lorna noticed the way Gideon's hand pressed briefly to his side, a fleeting shadow of pain crossing his stoic features when he thought no one watched. Combined with the letter that had drawn them here and the sacrifices he had already made, it raised a quiet fear in her newlywed heart. What hidden burdens did her giant protector carry that he had not yet shared, and would their fresh union at the altar be strong enough to face them when the storm returned in earnest? The morning after, the storm-tossed wedding in the old church broke clear and crisp, with sunlight filtering through the pines around the hollow like a gentle benediction on their new union. Lorna moved through the cabin with a quiet wonder, her fingers brushing the simple quilt Gideon had purchased for her at such sacrifice, now folded neatly on the bed they would share. The children, Ellie and Tommy, bustled about with excited energy, calling her Ma and him Pa in voices that rang like small bells of joy. Gideon had been mostly silent since the vows, but his actions spoke in the careful way he saddled the horses and hitched the wagon, preparing a supply run back to Willow Creek. Supplies were needed, and perhaps, Lorna thought, facing the town together, as husband and wife would seal their new reality. The wagon rolled into the town square under a bright midday sun, the wheels crunching over dried mud from the previous night's downpour. The air carried the sharp, clean sensory moment of rain-washed earth mixed with the warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread from the bakery and the faint tang of horses at the hitching posts. Lorna sat beside Gideon, her hand lightly on his massive arm. The children nestled safely between them. For the first time since arriving as a forsaken widow, she felt a fragile thread of belonging woven into her heart. But the town had not forgotten. The moment their wagon appeared, heads turned, and cruel whispers spread like wildfire through the gathered folks. A group of women near the general store clustered together, their bonnets bobbing as they sneered openly. "Well, look what the storm dragged in. The giant and his ugly bride," one called loudly, her voice dripping with mockery. "Married now, are they? What a joke. That scarred widow Vekepite had her big soft body trapping the mountain man. Bet her blood back east is still laughing at how well their prank worked." Laughter rippled cruelly from the men leaning against posts, their eyes raking over Lorna's full figure and the jagged scar on her cheek. Giant and his oversized mistake. How long before he sees what a burden she truly is? The words cut deep, testing the fresh vows like harsh wind against new saplings. Lorna's hazel eyes dropped for a moment, her rounded shoulders tensing beneath her calico dress. In that vulnerable stretch, a quiet emotional reflection washed over her, like the cool aftermath of the church storm. She had stood at the altar and said yes to this stoic protector, believing his strength could shield their fragile family. Yet here, in the public square, the same cruel jokes that had defined her life as an underdog returned with fresh venom. Would their union withstand the town's relentless scorn, or would the weight of her unconventional appearance prove too heavy even for Gideon's broad shoulders? Gideon's subtle character behavior shifted with deliberate calm. He drew the wagon to a slow stop, his immense frame straightening to its full towering height as he climbed down. The floorboards of the wagon creaked in relief from his weight. He offered Lorna his large hand first, helping her and then the children down with gentle care, his calloused palm warm and steady against hers. The children pressed close to her sides, sensing the hostility, but drawing courage from their new pay's presence. The sneers Ave kept bolder as the family walked toward the general store. "Ugly bride for a beast of a husband," another man jeered. "Wonder how that wedding night went with all that size between them." Cruel laughter echoed off the storefronts, turning the bright day bitter. Gideon stopped in the center of the square, his massive boots planted firmly in the dust. He turned slowly toward the loudest group, his piercing blue eyes locking onto them. With unyielding authority, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. He simply spoke, his deep voice low and resonant, carrying across the square like distant thunder that promised storm without needing to break. Enough. The single word fell with quiet power. Each syllable weighted with the mountain man's unshakable honor. "She is my wife. These are our children. Mock her again, and you answer to me." The effect was immediate and profound. The laughter died in throats. Faces paled. Men who had been bold moments earlier suddenly found the ground intensely interesting, shifting their weight and muttering excuses. Women clutched their baskets tighter and hurried away, their whispers silenced. The street cleared in seconds, folks scattering to doorways and side paths as if a grizzly had stepped into their midst. Gideon's public protection, tested in the fire of their cruelty, held firm, his stoic presence more effective than any shouted threat. Lorna stood beside him, heart swelling as she watched the transformation. 3 small warmth beats bloomed in her chest amid the retreating cruelty. The first came when Ellie slipped her tiny hand into Lorna's, squeezing with fierce pride and whispering, "Pa made them stop, Ma, for you." The second arrived as Tommy looked up at Gideon with wide-eyed admiration, declaring softly, "You re the strongest ever." The third settled deepest when Gideon turned back to her, his large hand resting gently on the small of her back. A subtle protective touch that spoke of quiet devotion, his blue eyes softening just for her in the now quiet square. They continued into the store without further incident, Mr. Hargrove serving them with nervous deference he had never shown before. The supplies were gathered: flour, beans, a bolt of warm fabric for winter clothes and loaded with Gideon's effortless strength. As they worked, Lorna felt the slow burn affection between them deepening, her giant husband's defense weaving stronger threads into their new marriage. The ride back toward the hollow carried a sense of hard-won peace, the prairie opening wide and golden before them. Lorna leaned slightly against Gideon's side, the children dozing in the wagon bed behind them. His silent strength had turned public scorn into respect, at least for today. She allowed herself to imagine winters by the fire, springs in the garden, a life where her sighs and scars were simply part of the woman he had chosen. Yet as the wagon crested a gentle rise and the cabin came into distant view, a sudden revelation brought unresolved emotional tension. Gideon shifted in the seat, and Lorna caught the briefest flash of pain crossing his stoic features as he pressed a hand to his side again. More noticeable now after the physical labor of loading supplies. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. In the quiet of their new union, the question hung heavy between them. What hidden injury or burden was her giant protector carrying in silence, and how long could his immense strength shield their family before the cost of his constant public protection became too great to bear alone? The days following their public stand in the town square settled into a quieter rhythm in the hollow, the autumn leaves turning the slopes into a tapestry of gold and crimson that whispered of change. Lorna moved through her new role as wife with careful tenderness, her homemaking skills turning the cabin into a true haven. Fresh bread cooling on the table each morning, mended clothes stacked neatly. The children's laughter filling the spaces where silence had once lingered. Gideon remained his stoic self, his massive presence a constant guardian, yet the weight of unspoken burdens seemed to press heavier on his broad shoulders with each passing day. One clear afternoon, with the children napping soundly after a morning of play, Gideon took Lorna's hand without a word. "River," he murmured, his deep voice low and authoritative. She followed him along the narrow path through the pines, the air carrying the crisp, earthy sensory moment of fallen needles, crushed underfoot, mingled with the clean, mineral scent of flowing water ahead. The riverbank emerged gently, its clear waters reflecting the blue sky like a polished mirror, the gentle current murmuring over smooth stones in a soothing rhythm that eased the edges of her heart. Gideon stopped at the water's edge, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the shallows. He turned to her then, his large hands settling gently but firmly on her shoulders, the warmth of his calloused palms seeping through the fabric of her calico dress. His subtle character behavior revealed itself in the deliberate steadiness of his grip, strong enough to guide, gentle enough to cherish. His piercing blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the world narrow to just the two of them. The river flowed steadily beside them, its surface shimmering ite hot, dappled sunlight. "Look," he said softly, turning her toward the clear water. Lorna hesitated, her reflection staring back at her. The full, soft curves of her body, wide hips and rounded belly that society had always mocked, the jagged scar tracing from her left cheekbone to her jaw like a cruel brand from the past. She tried to turn away, but Gideon's hands held her steady, not forcing, but anchoring her with quiet honor. "No," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his chest against her back. "See what I see, Lorna." In that vulnerable moment, a quiet emotional reflection washed over her like the river's gentle current. All her life, the world had turned her into the punchline of a cruel joke. Her ove kept no blood betraying her with a prankish mail-order match. Townsfolk sneering at her size and scar, calling her unworthy of love or belonging. Even after the altar vows and Gideon's public protection, she had carried the deep fear that her underdog heart could never truly be seen as beautiful. Yet here, with this giant cowboy's hands on her shoulders, destiny felt poised to rewrite every mocking word into something sacred and true. Gideon began to speak, each word measured and powerful, like stones placed carefully into the foundation of a home. "Your scar," he murmured, one large finger tracing lightly along her diave kep without touching the mark itself. "It tells of survival. You carried pain and kept walking. Motadorit strength on your face. Makes you real, makes you mine." Lorna's breath caught, her hazel eyes fixed on the reflection as his words wrapped around her like a warm quilt. Your softness, he continued, his hands sliding slowly down to rest at her waist, encompassing her full figure kept hot reverence. These curves, this belly, these hips, they speak of life and warmth, not weakness. They are the kind of beauty that holds a family. I see comfort in them. Mote see home. Mote adore every part the world called wrong. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not pull away. The river's clear water held their joined reflection steady, the current creating small ripples that distorted then clarified the image. Again. Your strength, Gideon went on, his voice deepening with quiet passion. The way you took those children in when you had nothing. The way you turned my dusty cabin into a place of light. The way you stand tall when they sneer. Mote adore your resilient heart, Lorna. Bigger than any mountain Mote ever climbed. He listed more, each praise a gentle counter to years of cruelty. The warmth in her smile that reached her eyes despite the scar, the gentle patience in her hands that baked and mended and soothed, the quiet courage that had crossed the plains as a forsaken widow, only to bloom in the hollow. His words flowed like the river itself, slow and steady, washing away the echoes of every jeer. 3 small warmth beats bloomed deep in Lorna's chest as the reflection began to shift in her eyes. The first came when a small fish jumped in the shallows nearby, its silver flash catching the light and reminding her of unexpected beauty in ordinary places. The second arrived as Gideon-esque, brushed warm against her hair, his massive frame a solid, protective wall behind her. The third settled deepest when she finally saw it, not the flaws the world mocked, but the woman Gideon adored. Resilient, soft-hearted, worthy of this giant cowboy's quiet love. For the first time, Lorna leaned back against him, her full figure fitting into his immense one, as if the river had always meant to bring them here. The cruel joke that had sent her west had turned, through his eyes, into the most profound destiny she could have imagined. Gideon turned her gently to face him, his blue eyes searching hers. You are beauty, Lorna. My beauty. She whispered his name, her hand rising to rest against his bearded cheek. The slow burn affection between them, finally igniting into something brighter and deeper in the river's quiet witness. Yet as they stood there wrapped in this tender revelation, a sudden unresolved emotional tension coiled in the air. Gideon shifted slightly, and Lorna felt the briefest tremor in his powerful frame, his hand pressing unconsciously to his side, where pain seemed to linger more persistently now. His stoic expression held, but in the clear reflection of the water behind them, she glimpsed the hidden cost of his constant protection. How much longer could her go-unnoted husband carry the burdens he refused to name, now that he had opened his heart so fully to her? The river's gentle murmur continued its soothing song as Gideon held Lorna close, his massive arms a protective circle around her soft, full figure. The late afternoon light danced across the water's surface, turning their shared reflection into something almost ethereal. For the first time in her life, the woman staring back at Lorna did not feel like a forsaken joke or a cruel punchline. She felt seen, truly seen. The crunch of small footsteps on the pine needle path broke the intimate quiet, pulling them gently from the moment. Ellie and Tommy had woken from their naps and followed the path, drawn by curiosity, and the invisible thread that now bound their little family. The children stopped at the edge of the riverbank, their eyes wide as they witnessed the tender scene. The towering giant cowboy with his hands on Lorna's shoulders, her leaning into him with a softness they had never seen before. The sensory moment wrapped around them all like a warm breeze. The cool, mineral-rich mist rising from the river's edge, mixing with the sweet, earthy scent of crushed pine needles under the children's bare feet, and the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke, drifting from the distant cabin chimney. It grounded the moment in something real and lasting. "Mama," Ellie whispered first, her small voice carrying across the water with hesitant wonder. The word hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. A pattern interrupt to the reluctant fears Lorna had carried since the children first trailed her in town. Tommy's face lit up, and without another word, both children broke into a run. Their small legs carried them swiftly across the bank until they crashed into Lorna's sides, wrapping their arms around her wide hips and soft belly, with all the fierce affection of hearts that had finally found home. "Mama," Tommy echoed loudly, his voice cracking with joy. "You and Pa, you look like family for real." Lorna stood frozen for a breath, her hands hovering above their tangled heads, before descending gently to stroke their hair. Gideon stepped back slightly, giving them space while remaining close, his subtle character behavior showing in the way he crossed his powerful arms over his barrel chest and watched with quiet satisfaction, the faintest curve touching his bearded mouth. In that embrace, a quiet emotional reflection settled deep within Lorna's heart, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds after a long storm. She had entered this frontier journey as a reluctant figure, betrayed by blood, mocked for her size and scar, convinced she possessed nothing worthy to offer a child. Motherhood had seemed a distant dream, too fragile for someone the world had labeled unworthy. Yet here, with these two orphans who had chosen her despite everything, and with Gideon's steady validation still warming her from the river's reflection, she realized the truth. She had become the mother she never dared dream of being. Not perfect, not small, or unmarked by life, but present. Loving. Enough. 3 small warmth beats bloomed in rapid succession, chasing away the last shadows of reluctance. The first came when Ellie pressed her cheek harder against Lorna's side, murmuring, "You smell like bread and safety, Mama. Don't ever leave us." The second arrived as Tommy looked up, his gap-toothed grin shining ve kepite hot pure trust while he declared, "We saw Pa showing you how pretty you are. He's right, you are beautiful, Mama." The third settled deepest when Lorna felt the children's heartbeats syncing with her own through their small bodies, a tangible rhythm that whispered of healing, a family forged not by blood but by choice and quiet resilience. She dropped fully to her knees then, her calico dress pooling on the riverbank as she pulled Bayote hot children into a fierce yet gentle embrace. Tears slipped down her scarred cheek, but they were healing ones, washing away years of self-doubt. She whispered, voice thick with emotion, "Not met your mama. For always." The words felt like a sacred vow, completing the reluctant motherhood that had stirred in her heart since those first tentative steps on the general store porch. Gideon knelt beside them, his immense frame folding with surprising grace. One large hand rested on Lorna's shoulder while the other ruffled Tommy's hair. The 4 of them formed a small circle by the river, the water's reflection now capturing not just Lorna's beauty in Gideon's eyes, but the complete picture of a family reborn from cruelty's ashes. The children's laughter rose soft and bright, mingling with the river's song in a harmony that felt like destiny's quiet triumph. They lingered there as the sun dipped lower, the children chattering about plans for a garden and stories by the fire, their excitement a balm against the world's earlier harshness. Lorna's heart swelled with a depth of love she had long denied herself. The giant cowboy had not only shown her her own beauty, he had helped her step fully into the role her soul had always yearned for but feared to claim. As they finally rose to walk back along the path toward the cabin, hands linked in a chain of protection and affection, Lorna allowed herself to imagine brighter days ahead. The slow-burn romance that had begun with a dusty arrival and cruel jokes had blossomed into something profound and healing. Yet as the cabin came into view, and the children raced ahead with renewed energy, a sudden revelation brought unresolved emotional tension, coiling tightly in Lorna's chest. Gideon lagged slightly behind her on the path, and when she glanced back, she caught him pressing a hand firmly to his side once more, his stoic face tightening ve kep ite hat, visible strain for a heartbeat, before he masked it. The hidden burden he carried seemed heavier now, especially after the emotional openness at the river. How much longer could her giant husband shield their newly embraced family before whatever secret pain he bore forced its way into the light, threatening the very home and motherhood she had finally accepted as her own? The path back from the river felt lighter under Lorna's boots, each step cushioned by the golden carpet of fallen pine needles, and the children's joyful chatter echoing through the trees. The river's clear reflection and Gideon's affirming words still lingered warmly in her chest, a gentle current that carried her forward into the embrace of reluctant motherhood she had finally accepted. Ellie and Tommy skipped ahead, their small hands occasionally reaching back to tug at her calico skirt, as if ensuring their new mama remained solidly with them. The cabin came into view as the sun dipped lower, painting the log walls in soft amber light. The sensory moment wrapped around them like a comforting quilt, the rich, earthy aroma of the wood smoke curling from the chimney, mingling with the sharp, resinous scent of the pines and the faint, sweet undertone of wild herbs Lorna had gathered earlier that week. It smelled of home, real and earned, no longer just shelter, but a place where hearts were mending. Once inside, Lorna moved to the hearth with quiet purpose, her homemaking skills blossoming fully in this new chapter. She stoked the fire until it crackled with lively warmth, then set about preparing their first true family meal as a married unit. Potatoes from the root cellar were scrubbed and sliced, their cool, firm texture grounding her hands. Carrots and onions joined them in the heavy iron pot, along with chunks of venison Gideon had brought home days earlier. The stew began to simmer, filling the single room with a savory, mouth-watering aroma that made the children's stomachs rumble audibly. She kneaded fresh dough for biscuits, her strong yet gentle hands working the flour with practiced rhythm, the soft give of the mixture yielding under her palms like a promise of abundance. Outside, Gideon had taken up his tools without being asked. The subtle character behavior revealed itself in the steady, methodical way he repaired the porch. His massive frame bent slightly over loose boards, hammer rising and falling with controlled power that made the wood sing rather than splinter. Each strike echoed with quiet authority, his broad shoulders flexing under his flannel shirt as he replaced weathered planks with new ones cut from fresh pine. He worked in silence, but every now and then his piercing blue eyes lifted toward the open doorway, watching Lorna move within the cabin. In the midst of chopping herbs to sprinkle over the stew, Lorna paused. A quiet, emotional reflection settled over her, like the golden light spilling through the window. Her skills had once been her only defense against a cruel world that mocked her size and scars. Now, in this blossoming homemaking, they wove something far greater, a nurturing space where reluctant motherhood had taken root and where a slow burn love with her giant husband could deepen. The betrayal by blood, the town's jeers, even her own doubts felt distant here. She was no longer just surviving. She was creating a legacy of warmth they kept hot, every stir of the pot and every folded napkin. The children set the table with eager hands, placing mismatched plates and tin cups with careful pride. Ellie arranged wildflowers in the center, another small touch learned from Lorna, while Tommy carried the heavy pot to the table with Gideon's help. As the family gathered, 3 small warmth beats bloomed in Lorna's heart amid the savory steam rising from the bowls. The first came when Ellie took her first bite and sighed happily, declaring with shining eyes, "Mama's stew is the best in the whole world. It feels like love inside." The second arrived as Tommy leaned against her soft side, his small head resting trustingly while he murmured, "Pa fixed the porch, so we want tea fall through. You two make everything better." The third settled deepest when Gideon, after tasting the meal, gave a slow nod of approval, his large hand covering hers briefly on the table, the touch sending a quiet spark through her, deeper than protection alone. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the ordinary magic of togetherness. Stories flowed around the table. The children's tales of imaginary adventures by the river, Gideon's rare murmured comments about the changing seasons. Lorna watched it all, her hazel eyes soft with contentment. Her homemaking skills had truly blossomed here, turning a remote cabin into a sanctuary where healing happened in small, daily acts. After the meal, as the children helped clear the dishes with sleepy yawns, Lorna stepped out onto the newly repaired porch. Gideon stood there, wiping his hands on a rag, the last rays of sunset catching the strong lines of his bearded face. Their eyes met in a tender glance that stretched longer than usual, filled with unspoken depth. In that shared look, questions hovered, about the future they were building, about the love growing steadily between them, like the stew that had warmed their bellies. His blue eyes held something more vulnerable tonight, a quiet invitation to deeper connection that made Lorna's heart quicken. She reached up, brushing a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead with gentle fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the porch. For seeing me. For all of it." Gideon covered her hand with his, the calused warmth enveloping her. No grand words, only the steady presence that had become her anchor. The moment felt like the truest expression of their slow-burn romance, wholesome, earned, and full of promise. Yet as the stars began to appear overhead, and the children called for a bedtime story, a sudden revelation brought unresolved emotional tension to the quiet evening. While Gideon turned to go inside, Lorna noticed him falter for the briefest second, his large hand pressing firmly against his side, with a tightness around his eyes that he quickly masked. The hidden strain she had glimpsed before now seemed more insistent, threatening the very stability of the home her blossoming homemaking skills had created. How much longer could her giant husband keep his secret burden concealed before it tested the depth of the growing love, reflected in that tender porch glance? The fire crackled softly in the hearth that final evening, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls as the family gathered close. Months had slipped by since the river reflection and the blossoming of their home, each day weaving stronger threads into the tapestry of their unlikely destiny. The cruel jokes of the past had faded into distant echoes, replaced by the steady rhythm of love, earned through quiet acts and steadfast protection. Gideon sat in his large wooden chair, his immense frame relaxed for the first time in many weeks, while Lorna nestled beside him on a cushioned bench. The children curled ate moat their feet with blankets wrapped around their small shoulders. The sensory moment wrapped around them like a tender embrace, the rich, smoky aroma of pine logs, burning mingled with the sweet scent of Lorna's fresh apple cobbler cooling on the table, its cinnamon warmth filling the room as, outside, the first gentle snowflakes of winter whispered against the window panes. It was a smell of abundance, of safety, of a life rebuilt from the ashes of mockery. Gideon shifted slightly, his subtle character behavior revealing itself in the careful way he reached for Lorna's hand, his large fingers intertwining they kept. Te had hers as if drawing strength from her touch. For weeks he had carried the hidden strain, a deep ache in his side from an old logging injury sustained years before she arrived, one he had never voiced lest it burden his new family. Tonight, under the fire's gentle glow, he finally spoke of it in low, measured words. The pain had worsened they kept ite hot his constant labors and sacrifices, but it was not defeat. It was simply part of the man who had chosen to stand for them all. Lorna listened, her heart aching with quiet emotional reflection that settled like soft snow upon her spirit. She had once believed herself unworthy of such a protector. Her big-sized figure and scarred face, a cruel joke turned destiny only through his eyes. Yet here, in this healed home, she saw the truth. Their love was mutual, their strengths shared. The betrayal by blood, the town's sneers, the reluctant steps into motherhood, all had led to this sacred wholeness where no one carried burdens alone. "I want to hide it anymore," Gideon murmured, his deep voice rumbling like the river they had stood beside. "But, with you, with all of you, more can rest when needed." We healed together. The children looked up, their eyes wide with understanding beyond their years. Ellie climbed into Lorna's lap, pressing close to her soft, comforting form. "We see you, Pa. And we see how strong Mama makes everything." Tommy nodded fiercely, leaning against Gideon's knee. "You protected us. Now we protect you too. That's what family does." 3 small warmth beats bloomed in the firelit room, gentle and profound, The first came when Ellie rested her head against Lorna's chest, whispering, "You showed us true worth, Mama, even when the town was mean." The second arrived as Tommy placed his small hand over Gideon's larger one, offering innocent comfort that brought a rare, deep smile to the giantess face. The third settled deepest when Lorna met Gideon's blue eyes across the fire, their shared gaze holding years of slow-burn affection now fully realized, no longer protector and protected, but partners in a love that had transformed every cruel beginning into eternal belonging. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing the hollow in quiet peace. Inside, the family lingered by the fire long into the night, sharing stories of their journey. The dust-choked arrival, the silent shadow who stepped forward, the river where beauty was finally seen. Gideon pulled Lorna closer, his arm around her shoulders, while the children drifted toward sleep with contented sighs. The giant mountain man and his underdog bride had found their forever, not through grand battles or dramatic rescues, but through steadfast honor, homemaking hands, and hearts that chose worth over worldly scorn. In the end, the cruel joke turned destiny had healed them all. The children saw true worth in both their parents, and the family stood whole, protected by the quiet strength of love that no frontier wind could ever scatter. As the fire burned low and embers glowed like distant stars, Lorna rested her head against Gideon's broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The prairie that had once mocked her now cradled their home. Here in the hollow, beauty was not reflection alone, but the life they had built together, scarred, soft, strong, and deeply cherished. And so the story of the giant cowboy and his forsaken widow comes to its gentle close, whispered like memories around an old campfire. What began with dust and cruel laughter bloomed into a love that healed wounds, embraced children, and turned every scar into strength. Gideon and Lorna taught us that true beauty is seen not by the mocking crowd, but by the one willing to stand firm. May their quiet legacies remind you that destiny often arrives wearing the face of protection, and that even the most unlikely hearts can build a home where every soul finds worth. This is a fictional, original story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are products of the author's imagination. This narrative adheres to family-safe guidelines and contains no graphic content.